Okay.
We are recording.
We are. And so my name is May Elawar. I am a faculty member at CIS in the Transformative Inquiry Department. I'm also an alum of the Women's Spirituality Program at CIS. And I think initially the draw between Monica and I was that spiritual element that she brings into her research and into her work. So I've been really fortunate to work with Monica and really learn from her through this collaboration. And very, very happy to introduce the other two committee members. We have Dr. Therese Generous with us. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
I'll just correct you. Therese Journas.
Therese. So, you know, my background, I am Arabic and my other language is French before English. So I'm like Therese Generous, sorry. And Professor Therese is the chair of the Somatic Psychology program at CIS. And we're so happy that you could be part of this dissertation process and bring in all that amazing knowledge and scholarship to support Monica. And it's also my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Danielle Wise. Dr. Danielle Wise is a practicing psychologist, an author, and a teacher. And I am really grateful to also everything she has contributed towards making this a phenomenal, I think, dissertation. Your contributions are so, so, so appreciated, and your wisdom and your experience, you know, because you walk those shoes. And so you really brought that in. So thank you both for being here today and for holding this space for Monica and guiding her on this amazing journey. So we will start today. I will turn it over to Monica, who will present her research to us. And that will be followed by some rounds of questions and feedback and appreciations by the committee. And then we'll open it to everybody present to ask questions. The committee will step away to confer and discuss the defense, and then come back and give Monica their opinion and talk about next steps. So if we can all just mute ourselves as Monica presents, and then unmute when we are going to speak. So without further, introductions, I'm going to turn it over to you, Monica, and it's all yours. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, May, and thank you for everyone being here and my committee members. Thank you. I am excited and nervous and really grateful for everyone that's here with us. I am going to start sharing my screen. Okay. There we go. Hold on a quick moment. Let's try this again. There we go. Hi. So, as May introduced, my dissertation is a phenomenological autoethnography. It's a psycho-somatic-spiritual transformation of childhood complex trauma. And for those whom I have not met, my name is Monica Renee Martin. I am in the East-West Psychology Department, and this is my labor of love. So thank you for being here. As we start, I would like to begin with an invitation to arrive with a brief meditation. And I invite you, if this feels comfortable and aligned with you, to join us. And so just start by noticing your breath. Notice how it moves in your body all on its own. And inviting yourself to arrive from wherever you may have been. Whenever you were exploring. Gently inviting yourself to come home. And your next breath, like a flower floating from the top of your head, just float naturally down through your head, into your chest, into your belly, and even moving just a little back towards your spine there. And from this place, I invite you to look around and express gratitude to all those, the ancestors, our communities, our support, family, and friends who have supported us to arrive at this moment now. And feeling each one of us on this call together as we hold space with and for one another. I thank you. And whenever you feel ready, gently moving your body, wiggling your fingers and or toes, and coming back into this space. So welcome. The research question, as mentioned, of my dissertation is the phenomenological autoethnography exploration of the lived experience from a transforming complex childhood trauma through psychosomatic practices to spiritual embodiment as healing. And it's exploring how the psychosomatic spiritual practices helped facilitate that transformation, as well as what was my lived experience through that entire process from the inside out. A couple key terms I would like to define, just so we are all understanding my form of complex trauma. Complex trauma, the term itself is specifically looking at childhood trauma. It's looking at an experience that a child experienced that was traumatic, in that their sense of safety, psychological, physical, or emotion was threatened, and their developmental skills were disrupted and compartmentalized, and it impacted their disability to function moving forward. And specifically in my research, it's looking at the complex trauma experience from reoccurring physical abuse from a caregiver. And the physical abuse was in the form of battery and aggression. And so embodiment, and defining what embodiment is it's defined as a lived experience within the body that includes the dimension of subjectivity and introspection that cannot be gathered from other ways of knowing and other means of wisdom. It is my contention that one can consciously connect with the deeper unconscious layers of memory, of emotion, of energetic currents from this embodied state as a form of transforming complex trauma into spiritual embodiment. And spirituality is using this term in the context of moving towards wholeness. It's moving towards one individual to a more expanded way of being and reaching the human spiritual potential. And then spiritual embodiment, I refer to Ferrer and his description of spiritual embodiment. He described embodied spirituality as the mystery of incarnation. It is the spirit becoming flesh. and our bodies are a transmutation of the spirit into fleshy form. The body is the spirit made flesh, and the life experiences are the ultimate union of humanity and divinity in the body. So that is the arc that we are moving toward. The background problem, looking at complex childhood trauma and speaking just a little briefly to it, is that the reality is that without early treatment or early intervention to those children who experience trauma, it predisposes them to development impairments in their functionality if they do not receive intervention in their childhood. It impairs their ability to create healthy relationships. It impairs their ability to create healthy self-concept and self-awareness. It impacts their self-esteem. It impacts their ability to thrive. And so looking at all the psychological and the behavioral issues in developmental is looking at the real need of how do we address complex childhood trauma, specifically from physical abuse. There is a lot of research that has been conducted on sexual abuse, on maltreatment, but there is little to speak of actual physical abuse and how it impacts a child developing.
Monica, sorry to interrupt. Are you moving the slides forward on your screen or not yet?
I am, yeah.
Because
I haven't yet.
Okay, sorry, because I got a chat that they're not moving forward. Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt about that.
I was speaking off this slide.
Okay, sorry, no, because I just wanted to make sure that
Yeah.
So sorry yeah.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Maybe if you made them like what do they call it? View them as a whole slideshow, then use a slideshow view.
So show the entire
Yeah.
slideshow at the entire time. I don't know how
No,
to do that.
no. Just leave it. Just leave it as is.
Okay.
It's fine.
Okay.
But just you haven't moved them forward because people were concerned that they weren't moving forward on their screen. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
You're welcome. No, it's okay. I like questions. When I was practicing earlier, so I'm so used to it, more dialogue and didactical, and I'm like, this is weird. I like to say any questions.
Thanks.
So the big why is the significance, is looking at why explore this, why research this, and the significance starts with me. It's very personal. This is a personal story. This is my experience. I experienced trauma as a child from physical abuse, and I moved through the process of healing. And in my experience, I'm a student, hence academic. And so in my process, I learned so much, and I read research about psychology and somatics and spirituality and how somebody heals. And I understood this theory. And yet when I went into the room, I experienced not relief. I did not experience healing in so many different times in so many different ways. And so my motivation is to explore and research my experience so I can say, okay, here are the gaps in between the theory and the implementation, and here's how we can do better. Here's how we can actually meet the needs in a different way to help support the healing of complex trauma from physical abuse. And in looking at myself first, it's taking that and then applying it to academics. Like, okay, here's the levels and the layers and the dimensions that we are missing in academia and in the research we can add to this field. And then we can also improve the actual training of therapeutics and the implementation to actually support those that are in need. So I wanted to discuss briefly the literature review as far as the overscope of what I saw in the research that I conducted. And there's three fields that I primarily focused on. I would like to name that it by no means is an exhaustive list. These are the dominant ones because they primarily are what I experienced and what I went through, so I can apply it to the methodology, which I'll speak to later. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy, somatic therapy, and then spirituality. And the reason I created the image next to it is that's how, like in my mind, that I was seeing the literature. Like the red is the cognitive research. That is the largest in the field. There's more research. There's more experimentation, qualitative and quantitative mixed methods that go into that field. And then the green is somatic therapy. It's developing. It's not as breadth and depth as a cognitive, as well as I intentionally overlap them because there are certain modalities which they do intersect. However, I'll explain later that where they're included is still from a cognitive-based framework rather than the actual somatics holding its own integrity. And then the third piece is the spirituality, is the blue. And I put it because it's touching the other two, because it's not specifically incorporated as a modality or methodology. It is used as theoretical as well as an external resource in the healing, but not specifically how do we incorporate and include spirituality in the healing process.
So is that a slide, Monica, that you were referring to?
Yeah, which one, the images?
Yeah, because so with the PowerPoint, you need to move the slides so we can see the one you're referring to.
So what are you seeing right now?
We're only seeing the introduction, the title of your dissertation.
Oh.
That's what I was trying to say earlier.
Oh, I did not realize that.
Sorry, yeah. I was not here. I was so mortified at interrupting you, but there.
Let me.
I was mortified at interrupting you. I wasn't. There you go. So if you can just
kind
of go with.
Yeah, I didn't okay, I get it now. So, okay, so you can see any of these, which is okay. I just talked about it. So this is where we're at. This is the image that I was talking about. I apologize. And the images that I was using was talking about how the red is the cognitive, is the largest in the field, as far as there's more research and there is more studies that have been done in qualitative, quantitative mixed methods. And then the green again is the somatic, because it is a developing field, yet not as large, not as a large number of studies that are point to it. And then again, how I mentioned that the overlap is there because there are therapies and there are modalities that include both. Yet what I'll speak to later is it is still the cognitive modality. It's still from that orientation as well as from that lens. And the last piece is spirituality, is that it touches the others, but there's not actually integrated and incorporated into them. Okay. Now I understand. You couldn't see my slide. So cognitive therapy, with each one of the three, I am going to discuss, I'm going to name the modalities and the theories that I touch on in my research, and then touch on the benefits with complex trauma, the detriments from healing and working with trauma, as well as there's a couple that specifically name and look at what are the detriments to complex trauma and working with these specific modalities. So with cognitive therapy, the four modalities I have there is the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Prolonged exposure.
Move the slide, Monica, again. Move the slide to cognitive therapy.
Oh, so you can't even see.
Yeah.
What do you see right now? We
still see the literature review. So you have to actually, yeah. Sorry again. Okay. Yeah.
That's weird. You know what I'm going to do? It kind of looks funky, but I'm going to just not do it in slideshow format. Does this work okay?
That didn't change anything. So if you click on cognitive therapy right now, if you click on that one, will that slide come up into the center?
Yeah, you know what I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'm going to start it again because that might help it.
All right. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm giving a presentation in the
slides
and let's try that.
Yeah, there you go.
You can see it?
Yeah.
When I change it now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to do it this way because
Thank you.
It's going to make it easier.
Yeah.
Text sometimes is not So cognitive therapy, like I mentioned, I'm going to just touch on the 4 different modalities we're looking at. Cognitive focus, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure, and then the other 2, the eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, and emotional freedom technique, or EFT, are the 2 that I mentioned, that they do include components of somatic and of the body. However, it's still from a cognitive framework and a cognitive location. The primary focus is looking on your thoughts. How do we change someone who is in trauma response and they're having acute reaction and they're having obsessive thoughts, and so in order to change them, it's looking at how do we incorporate the body in an objective way, the body as the object, as opposed to the inclusivity of the subjectivity, meaning that how do we actually incorporate the body from the inside out, as opposed to using it as an object to change its response and to regulate it by controlling it. So the benefits of looking at cognitive therapy is that it is beneficial to help mitigate the chronic symptomology. Chronic symptoms of having, like I was mentioning, of the obsessive thoughts, of the self-doubt, of the negative self-worth and self-concept. And it helps to mitigate those. It's as well as it helps to reduce hyperarousal and anxiety. It gives the tools that when somebody is in an acute stage of trauma response, that I kind of refer to it as a triage. It's good to help go from this acute heightened stage to civility. And the last piece is that it helps address the maladaptive self-perception of trying to change your thoughts and change your beliefs of how you see yourself and others. The detriment in the studies that I was finding is that it is beneficial on the initial. However, in the long-term studies, the efficacy started to reduce, as well as it increased the population, their ability to go into heightened states of avoidance of coping skills. And so a lot of this in my own research, when I was looking at, again, it was the initial, it addresses the symptomology of what's happening from complex trauma, but it doesn't start to really get underneath to what is the actual wounding, what's the depth of what's here. So I can address the thoughts, I can address the flashbacks, I can address the intrusive memories, but they're still going to be coming back and they're still going to return. And so it's a constant maintaining and constant mitigation, as opposed to really rooting out and addressing that. And looking at the objectivity of the body, of how do I fix it, as opposed to how do I look at it, how do I be with the body and really meet it where it's at, the emotions and memories, and start to work with it differently. And specifically speaking to complex trauma, is that it's been found to actually exacerbate emotional dysregulation. So trying to use some cognitive therapies and cognitive models, it actually starts to amplify the thoughts and amplifies the response the individual is having, as well as there's the potential for re-traumatization or even dissociation. One thing to mention is that the cognitive therapies and a lot of the models are very goal-oriented. How do we reduce the symptomology and return this person back to the state they were before the trauma? And the reality is what they experienced has changed them. And so trying to go back to who they were and relate to the world from that place state doesn't exist anymore. So it creates even more internal conflict. Somatic therapy. So it's looking at somatic therapy and the 4 different modalities and theories that I have on the left side of sensory and motor processing, somatic experiencing, trauma-focused or trauma-informed yoga, as well as cranial psychotherapy. So this is taking the modalities and looking at how the body responds from trauma and the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system and how to return it back to regulation. And how do we work with the body and working with the breath and working with our body awareness. And the benefits are it helps to improve self-regulation. It helps to process emotions in a different way. In non-cognitive, it works from a more somatic way of processing emotions. And also the two go together of it helps to repair and develop interoception as well. And part of that process is by being able to slow down, because if someone in trauma response is in this amplified, heightened state, and everything's happening and moving and thinking at the same time. So going to the somatics helps us slow the process down, isolate a single sensation, and be able to identify it. What happens to a child who has had complex trauma is there's a disconnection that occurs from their brain and their cognitive thinking to what's actually happening in their sensations. And so the somatic process helps to reconnect that, and taking a single sensation of like a muscle contraction, like what does that feel like? Where is it in the body? And able to do it in a slow motion that you can repair that without overwhelm or hyperarousal. The detriments, potential detriments of somatic therapy with trauma is that one is that it doesn't include the spirituality component. It includes it as a theory, as an external resource, but it leaves out the spiritual dimension as how do we incorporate that into the spiritual embodiment of healing. And the other piece that I added there and is the role of the therapist, which is a benefit because the individual can learn by mirroring from their therapist how to regulate, how to hold a container. So it is a benefit and a detriment, because if the therapist has not been trained to be able to hold that space and container, or they're not able to track the individual, it can actually re-traumatize them. It could feel a sense of disconnection. For myself, when somebody was not present, I would get into a heightened, activated state. And so to me, where the research is going, where I want it to go, is how do we actually help to treat that and label it and qualify it in a way to really repair the complex trauma. And the last things of the complex trauma is that it has the potential, because so much of the unconscious memories and sensations are in our tissues, is that if it is done too quick, too fast, it can lead to hyperarousal. It can lead to overwhelm, sensory overwhelm, as well as accessing repressed trauma memories, which have been denied and repressed, that was non-conscious, and then leading to emotional dysregulation. Last one is spiritual therapy. To name this, there is not a lot of significant actual studies that have been done on spirituality and complex trauma, if any. It speaks to it theoretically, and it speaks to how it can support and how it can be detrimental to individuals with trauma. The different theories that came up in my research is post-traumatic growth, spiritual emergence, and psychosynthesis. The benefits are that it gives a framework to assuage the inner conflict an individual is having, as well it gives it a context and a language to be able to address the existential crisis. The detriments and the harms that could be done with spiritual therapy and trauma is that it can create, it can actually increase the psychological conflict. That if there is no psychological framework or tools that an individual has had, and they move into the spiritual modality, it can actually amplify the complexes and the fragmentation that's happening in the individual, their experience. And the opposite of addressing existential crisis, it actually can induce an existential crisis, and potentially even leading to suicidal ideation. And then spiritual bypass, and even a psychotic break. So it's dissociating and reframing so much in a way that the individual starts to disconnect. And the challenge with complex trauma is you have a fragmented, compartmentalized individual. And so if they're going to all of a sudden start going even more so in a singular dimension like spirituality, then the wounding from the psychological aspect or the somatic aspect are are not being addressed. And so when this starts to fracture and become even more significant of a difference, then there's even more of a crisis that potentially can happen of detrimental, of going into relapse or going into rapid cycling, re-traumatization and dissociation. Lastly, just to name additional gaps that I've noticed. One is that there is no actual research, like in research, qualitative, quantitative, of embodiment in trauma and how trauma impacts it, and actually looking at it not just from a theoretical and not just from a casework, but an actual larger qualitative study. And the other two I've briefly mentioned is, one is the impact of spiritual development on complex trauma. Like a child who experiences complex trauma, how does that impact and disrupt their spiritual development? And lastly, the gap between the lived experience of actually the theory of all the modalities that I've discussed and talked, and then the lived experience of what did that actually happen and occur for someone who's healing through trauma. Okay, the research. So moving on to methodology. I want to name, like, I love complex, not that I love complex trauma, I love my topic, I really do. And one of the things that surprised me the most is I love the methods of what started coming out and teasing out of my dissertation. So my dissertation is a qualitative phenomenological autoethnography, and just first and foremost to name of the evolving qualitative research. And what I mean by that is, as the social sciences and the humanities become more reflective and representative of the world beyond Western-centric positivistic philosophies and beyond social constructs, so much research paradigms in academia, our world is changing. Our world has been changing and evolving and has been doing for a long time. And our forms of research and our forms and ways to deepen with inquiry and deepen with knowledge and wisdom is still within this positivistic Western blocked mindset and fix. And to me is that because the paradigms of epistemology and ontology are evolving, so does our ways and our means to be able to explore that information. There are so many diverse openings up and ways of knowing that is not limited into just qualitative, quantitative research, as well as looking at how changes of social theory and social justice and the marginalized, their voices and their experiences that don't fit into the paradigms with which we have been researching, it leaves out a whole landscape of wisdom and knowledge. And so in choosing the methods that I chose is very much in aligned with how we change and challenge and explore in ways that we really can find the information in a different way. Otherwise, we are limiting our scope, and we've already put our bias blinders on before we even started researching. So as I mentioned, my research is qualitative, it is phenomenological, and it is an autoethnography. To speak to autoethnography, I will fully own a name. When I first learned of autoethnography years ago, I did not want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because to me, I had my own projection, and I'm like, oh my God, that's cheating. That's cheating, that doesn't count. That was the last thing I wanted to do, and here's what I did. And to me, there could not be anything more challenging to do, because moving through my dissertation, I did it with such the intentionality to hold integrity and hold rigor, and to put myself and to have that perspective of being able to put myself in that discomfort of that specific phenomenon, to be in that lived experience. And I put myself in, and so I was both researcher and subject. And it's a challenge. It's no joke. It's not easy to do, but it's a challenge to be both to know what it actually feels like, as opposed to be externally observing and witnessing and watching and listening from somebody else's experience, as opposed to be actually in it, is a whole different process. Not only to be in it to feel it, but to intentionally be curious while being in it. And to me, it's like being in a triggered state. This was my intention the last couple of years, of to be in a triggered state and to be curious. So to be in hyperarousal and being, what is that? And to hold myself in that integrity throughout my whole dissertation is my process. And I bring the multidimensional experience as a trauma survivor, as an academic, as a scholar, as a practitioner, and to be able to come from all these different lenses intentionally and to move the positionality. I think of the Buddhist parable that talks about the elephant. Like each one of the monks has a different piece of the elephant that they can hold. And so those are the different parts of me. I can get a bigger, larger picture, a holistic picture, being able to put on those different experiences. So my story is as that was the data. And what I did is I used artifacts. I specifically went through and I had journal entries and emails from 2005 to 2019. And so I used those as my data, my artifacts. And to clarify, because there is a lot of memoir likeness as well as autobiography likeness in my dissertation. The difference to me is well, it's kind of temporality and then some. Is because memoir is like sitting down in this moment and just writing down the memories as they come through. Whereas I intentionally use journals and artifacts and emails that were written at the time of the inquiry that I was actually exploring. The last piece that I want to talk about, autoethnography, is the Ellis names the impressionistic qualities. There's similarities of an impressionistic story to an autoethnography that is named as they're both forms of inquiry, they're both forms of expression, they're both forms of self-discovery and transformation. And similar to an impressionistic story, there is a story arc. That in my story, it's the journey from complex childhood trauma to spiritual embodiment as healing. So to touch on phenomenology, my phenomenology is a very large philosophy, and there's very large branches of the umbrella. And for my research, I specifically chose transcendental phenomenology because it specifically focuses on the experience itself and how this one single phenomena is experienced, and how to use sensory phenomena to understand and interpret the world from that phenomena and that location, and to explore consciousness as a process of becoming through negation. As a phenomenology, it's this process of bracketing, and you stay and you remain with that phenomena, with that sensation, with that experience, and you start peeling away what it is not. So you can stay with it all the way down to the root essence of what it is. And to me, spiritual embodiment is a state of consciousness in which transformation of trauma occurs. This is the methodology to really get down to the essence and the root of it. And to name and disclose as well, because bracketing is the process of removing and putting aside presuppositions, assumptions, knowledge, experience, just to stay with the essence of the experience as is. We are human, we are natural, and we have biases, and I completely own and name that I entered into this research with biases. Particularly, this is my story that I experienced trauma and physical abuse from a caregiver, from a family member, and so I have my experiences and my relationship developed with him. So through this whole process of just staying with that and being able to let go of the story making and the meaning making and the theories, and just staying with what that experience of the trauma was, and looking at how it oriented myself into the world and how I made choices because of what that was, I was able to start to intentionally let go of the biases that I once held at the beginning. Did I do that right? Yeah. So a little bit of nuts and bolts and my design. So the design of my research is I chronologically gathered materials from 2005 to 2019. Oops, that's got a cap. And I clustered the pages or the years into 3-year increments. And I, in total, had 2,272 pages of raw data, raw material. And what I did through, yeah, it's a lot. and I went through each one 4 times. And so I wanted to ensure that this was rigorous on my side and I had my detail in it. And so I went through each of these clusters 4 different times. The first time was for somatic processing. And so I would read through the content. And while I was reading through the content, I was engaging in authentic movement. And so I'd be moving because as my body was doing its own unwinding and processing of the unconscious material, as I moved through in and out everything. The second time I moved through the content was for creative expression. Similarly, it was very unconscious movement. I had pens and papers and crayons and sometimes write on the emails and the text. I would just creative processing. It's very unconscious, whatever is the unconscious processing that needed to occur. Emotions would come up and then go down until it reached this felt sense of completion. The third time I read through felt sense meaning units. And what that means is I would read through the information and always attune to my body. And then I would feel my body go into still point, which is a craniosacral term. So I want to go into stillness. It's almost like if I can physically do the motion, my body went in and then down. And it just went dropped, like your belly drops. Like there was something there. And so I would extract whatever that passage was. I pull it out and I put into a new document and gather data that way, all through the clusters. And the fourth time I went through is that I would, similar to the felt sense, where the felt sense would stop, I would start just stream of conscious writing from the fragments that I pulled from the felt sense meaning unit. I would just start to write and type and type and type. And it's similar to like somatic processing in a sense where it was stream of conscious, I'd let the words flow, and I would just type and type and type and type and type, not think, not filter, not analyze, not create theory, and just let it flow out until it felt like it reached conclusion. And at the end of that, I generated 129 pages of raw data. So the felt sense, as far as embodied research, the felt sense I engaged with was authentic movement that I mentioned, and then the focusing. And then one piece I do want to highlight is the embodied writing, the actual process of writing my dissertation. Embodied writing, I note to Rosemary Anderson, is that it reveals the lived experience of the body by portraying in words the finely textured experience of the body and evoking sympathetic resonance in readers. And to me, again, this goes to the transpersonal experience, and it's the evolving form of research that we're in. Instead of me writing in isolation and writing down my experience and having somebody else read the data, it starts to open up that invitation for conversation between the author and the reader. This is better. Is that, as Ellis commented, that a profound and intimate phenomenological autoethnographic writing engages the interpersonal relationship with and between the researcher and the reader. And the best authentic writings are truthful, vulnerable, evocative, and transformative. I chose autoethnography, phenomenology, and embodied reading because in writing what I wrote, it's not just the content, it's not just the information, but it's experiential as well. In engaging in this transpersonal relationship between myself and the reader, it starts to drop both of us into a different level and a different place of wisdom for it to rise. And part of the process of my dissertation is I gave my dissertation to a peer reviewer and to somebody else to give feedback of what their experience was, the questions, if they found holes or gaps. And the response that I had and the feedback from my peer reviewer was that it took me to an experience that was multidimensional, that came in and out of focus really well, from macro to micro, from theoretical to experiential. I felt like I was having an experience that was mirrored in the content of the writing. When I stopped reading, I felt multidimensional and really expansive. I feel that way right now, just recalling the experience when reading the material. The state of mind I was left with is anchored in me that I can recall and still have that transpersonal, transcendent experience. And looking at evolving research and how do we take it to another way of expression and starting to open up other ways of knowing and other ways of exploration and inquiry. To me, embodied writing, embodied research is important and pivotal to it. What did I find? So as far as the findings, the story arc again was the journey, it was exploring the journey to spiritual embodiment and healing. And each one of the clusters, what was happening was that each one had its own theme that was emerging. Did not expect that, did not look for it. It was after I came to and looking at the research, like there was a very consistent theme that was pervasive in the data and the reports that were coming. And so 2005 to 2007, it was consistently searching outside of self. And so coming from someone with complex trauma as this beginning stages of healing is constantly looking to giving their power and giving their authority consistently still to someone outside of themselves, to their teachers, to their therapist, to whoever that was, to find answers, and as getting as far away from themselves as possible in a way. The second cluster, 2008 to 2010, was perseverance and not healing. And so this was consistently looking at constantly trying, constantly doing different modalities, different therapies, different research, and again, just maintaining. And even more difficult than just maintaining is like constantly having to work just to be functional and never really getting and receiving that full release and that full transformation or recovery, no matter how hard it works. And then 2011 to 2013 was awakening to discomfort. And what was happening there is that self-awareness started expanding, started developing. And the more it started to grow, the more aware I was of somatic experience, my body, of my thoughts, of spirituality, the more it was actually painful, because I was more aware of relationships, of environments, of situations. And so the actual sensations, like the increase of sensitivity, the increase of awareness was heightened, and I didn't know what to do with it. The next cluster is a deep longing to belong. So coming out of even more awareness, even more healing in that process, it was a realization that the communities and the family and the social networks that I had established could not meet me where I was. And so it was painful in the healing process because I continually kept wondering what I was doing wrong. That's a complex child is going to put it on themselves and on the inside. So it must be me. It must be me moving through everything. And so the struggle and the pain of not having the support in the ways that really nourished made it even more juxtaposed. And then the last cluster is refined disentanglement to liberation. I kind of look at this as like the PhD of healing. It's being able to synthesize, of having all the practice and all the awareness, and then finally synthesizing, and not just triangulate, but really synthesize the psycho-somatic-spiritual mastery of being able to disentangle oneself from the different thoughts, from the different relationships, without reactivity, with just real intentionality. And not just to think differently, but you're moving the consciousness thread out of your actual physical system. And so that is the last cluster. So overall, things that I would like to highlight. I have the columns as far as where it does support the literature, where the findings come up. But I did want to highlight instead the additional findings that came up in my research. So the big ones that came up as far as one, that it became increasingly challenging as healing. The increase in challenge, it came as healing becoming more aware. Let's try language again. Okay. How it became more challenging, the more I became aware, the more I healed, how more difficult it actually became to be in the world. Because I would have increased and heightened sensitivities physically, energetically, more subtle energies. And so the more I became aware in a coarser, denser world and people who aren't as aware, it actually was more painful in my healing process. The lack of community and support. And so again, moving through this process of awakening, of spiritual embodiment, of not having a healthy community and container to go to continuing the healing process was a challenge and a difficulty in the process. And then the need for the integration of psychosomatic-spiritual integration. There is a positive as well as a detriment to going to each one for different things, the spiritual, the cognitive, and the psychological or the somatic. But having somebody to be able to hold all and integrating it helps to really root in the healing. So there's not as much the deregulation and the relapsing and the recovery. And the last one I do want to talk is the dangers of the Western-centric framework of spirituality on complex trauma. I own and I name that because of where I live and because of my availabilities to therapies and healing, that psychology and somatics and spirituality is very Western-centric. It's very much from a Western lens. And I was not aware until after I went through my dissertation and the findings of how detrimental and harmful spirituality from a Western lens can be. And I say that in the sense of the reframing that happens. It can perpetuate complex trauma. It can perpetuate a narrative that's not true, as well as it can still disconnect myself from my own lineage and my own heritage that I came from, and choosing to go along a path of healing that that doesn't fully resonate. So the last piece is just the limitations in future research. First and foremost, limitation, it's an autoethnography. It is based on me. It's a single narrative. It's my biased experience. It is my story, my experience, and I am not everyone. And so looking on moving forward is actually conducting a qualitative phenomenological research of a larger population and being able to research others who have healed complex trauma, psychosomatic-spiritually, and to understand their lived experience and understand their exploration, and to see if there are parallels or differences and nuances, and how can we take those sources of information and, again, how can we make it better? How can we really create a healing model that really supports the healing of complex childhood trauma? Language as a limitation, because I use English words and trying to describe somatic body experiences and spiritual experiences, which do not exist in the verbal realm, it's already limited. And even trying to name it and describe it, it already has altered and changed what the experiences is. And a curiosity for myself, it would be a huge undertaking, is further research on how do we explore the limitations of language in research, and potentially is there a way to evolve and change research to meet it in a better way or capture it in a different way. And then the Western-centric psychological framework of psychology, somatics, and spirituality is the other limitation. This is my lens and my experience that I have, and it's very limiting considering the growing field of cultural psychology, Black psychology, indigenous psychology, and really getting different voices. My own heritage is Filipina, and looking at what would the lens and the filter be in a different experience and different orientation. Yeah, I think I did know. I'll name this as well as far as like designing a model and training curriculum is like how do we take and put into practice, because I am a practitioner too. I'm not just all academic. How do we actually put this into roots? My partner and I started a nonprofit about a year and a half ago. Live Like Goose Grief and Trauma Recovery, and the vision has always been to build towards community and implementing the modalities and implementing a lot from the research. How do we create a healing community that can meet everyone where they are? Yeah. So the last thing I would love to say, I cannot thank my committee members. I really can't. Like Danielle, Therese, and May, thank you. It has been a wild ride. And my dissertation and my research, oh, I'm emotional. It would not be what it is without each one of you. And it's a refinement. Like every time I would submit it and I get it back, it was just another process of refinement. And like the little girl in me was like, oh, more work. Like when she's tired. She's been doing this for a lot of years. And then the other part of me would get really excited, like when I was done with like the feedback and suggestions, I go, oh my God, it's so much better. And so it would not be what it is without your lens and your feedback. So thank you so much for all your work and your patience and that. And May, you have been with me for a very long time, and you understand my research is not, it's atypical. And I could not have been more divinely guided to work with you. So thank you for your support and your feedback and your encouragement. So thank you. With that, I ask, what are the questions?
Wow. So I just want to take a moment for all of us to maybe if we were face to face in person, we would clap now for this phenomenal presentation. Maybe we can wiggle and express a complete appreciation and congratulations for an excellent presentation, Monica. Thank you. Thank you so much. And typically we move now into rounds of questions, feedback, and appreciations from your committee. And, you know, I've been with you for a long time. I'm intimately knowledgeable of your work. I've asked a lot of questions already. So what I would like to do is really open it to your two other committee members before I jump in, and maybe start with the Dr. Danielle Wise, who's external to CIS, and invite you in for an appreciation, feedback, question, comments.
That was fabulous. Congratulations. And it's been an honor to have come into this when I did, and absolutely appreciate coming in close to the end and your patience with these revisions, knowing what it's like to be that close and yet come with those refinements. And so I appreciate hearing that. And I also have been honored to have learned from you, and to have learned from more today as well. And that there's much that you get to bring into the world as a colleague now that we can work together with these processes. A couple of points I'd like to acknowledge is your willingness, but also your demand that spirituality and embodiment are together, and that it's a process where you speak of it, that the embodiment and the inherent wisdom that we have, which as somatic therapists, we get to experience that on our own accord. We need to practice what we teach constantly, and to be able to understand this embodied experience versus just this thinking cognitive experience is so important. And that embodiment actually brings into the spirituality, I heard you say, and in that we find our wholeness, and in that seeking we find that wholeness. And I feel that that's something that one of quite a few pieces that you bring to the field that is so important of what you're bringing, who you are as a scholar, now how this process has brought something that's very new to the field or not spoken to enough, which I appreciated the first time that I read your dissertation, when you spoke of that process that we can be somatic therapists, and yet we continually return to thinking processes, and that especially the American way, the European way is in the body and is in touch and has a different way of working with the body. And it's so important for more people to bring it into the research and make a statement that how do we come into the body as this wisdom and as a spiritual process as well. I appreciate also something that I haven't seen in Ellis and in a lot of the literature, when there's that beautiful list that you had on one of your slides, the piece that's missing when we do autoethnography, because we're still science and we're still research and we're still, as I've talked to you a couple of times, we're still speaking to a world that is barely letting autoethnography into the world, personal narrative, memoir as research. A word that we don't get to use in research is our own vulnerability. And yet, in order to be embodied, in order to bring that spiritual piece and do the work the way that you did, you had to be willing and demand your own vulnerability to the work as well. And that vulnerability is credited to the bracketing, because to be willing to do research, I believe that what we saw in your work is by being willing to move the bias to the side, we learn more about ourselves and other. And so that's where the scholarly piece that you did in the research and your vulnerability to do this on yourself, on your own, the topic of your own experience, that vulnerability is actually the inherent piece in your research that adds that dimension, because you do it as a phenomenological piece, because you were willing to say, I'm going to bracket these parts out, put them over there, they're going to stay over there. I know that they're there, and sometimes they're screaming at me over there, and I'm going to continue to observe how this can emerge differently. And I appreciate you as a researcher doing that. And so I have a couple of questions for you. One is that you and I have discussed is this idea of the fluidity to change. How did this process, was it difficult? What do you do with that? How do you begin to bring into your future research and the work that you'll be doing with clients with this, where those locations are in your body, and how do you access these different states of consciousness as a spiritual form, when yet in our Western mindset and in this culture, those worlds might not be able to come together? Do you see a place where you can look at where that embodied space changes and the complexity of that?
I do. And it's a great question. It's a challenging one and a good question, in that looking at, I already implement parts of it into, as a practitioner, of the different locations of the body. And to me, the head orientation of going into consciousness from the head, the cognitive placement, drop into the heart for the emotions, and the belly for like the grounding, to me are a first step. And I say a first step because for those who have never had that practice before, it's a first way to get them familiar with that, because I've practiced it so much. I can access the different states of cognitive or somatic from different locations of my body and feel how each one has its own. It's like going from California to New York. It's a different territory and different place. But to be able to teach people where, like, a physical location, and just to experience that, I find is its own process in and of itself. Because as you mentioned, as you were naming the process of bracketing, is that naming a certain location that everyone can identify and be there together, but have their own experiences, and being open to that is part of the process. And if I go into, like, right behind my eyes and, like, a pituitary gland, and you that do the same thing, we're not going to have the same experience. And to me, that's where the juice is. Like, what are you experiencing? And being able to have that and hold it together, I feel is really, is the potential to bring it into the world in a different way. And the challenge with the Western, as you were bringing up, like, the Western model, is that there's a certain very linear process to it. It's very specific. You go, I can go into anatomy, and you can talk where, like, the sinews and everything connects. But to me, it's an interesting way to start to go in, because people can locate through physicality. And then from there, with the bracketing, start to dissolve into the different experiences. And so to me, how do I bring that work into other people in other ways? it's twofold. One, directly working with clients and doing that as I started playing with and adapting. And it's amazing it's meeting people where they're at. Some people are at the first initial stages of learning, and some are ready to open up to other states of consciousness that they are like right on the cusp. And the other part for me has to do with actually entrainment. Is one of my craniosacral teachers. I will say this all the time. My favorite thing that she would teach us is like, be the biggest pendulum in the room. And by doing so is that I cultivate like you're talking about somatic therapist, I cultivate my energy, my somatic care, so that when someone else I'm in relationship with, our body starts to mirror. It's like you're playing a guitar and the strings will vibrate to the other one just because it was a vibration. And so teaching people how to experience that, even with a non-language, brings them into a different place. I don't know if that necessarily answered the question of how to bring it into a Western-centric world, but it's my attempt at it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, first of all, what I just heard you say is meeting the client where they are. And I also appreciate what I heard in your experience of bracketing as an embodied experience rather than an intellectual research experience. And I appreciate that also,
Yes.
bringing that into the body, and that respect that you have on matching that, and the mirror neurons, the experience of who we are, but then also the spiritual heart-centered experience of bringing all that in together. And that's the beauty. And that's the importance of somatics, our vulnerability, and speaking from an embodied experience, which is smaller, like you said, in that research. So I have two more questions. One is, have you considered also how complex trauma can also be the experience of a religious dogmatic trauma in childhood, and the complication that it brings to the word spirituality and coming into the body when we're working with clients who have had complex trauma due to their religious experience?
I have considered it. I can speak to personal experience with it. And I did not include it in my research, just intentionally. Even as I name it, I wasn't ready to process my own piece around it. I grew up in a Catholic childhood, and I at one point was a self-claimed atheist, and a lot of my healing process had the complexity of feeling abandoned by God for what I experienced. And so being able to hold the space for that, and for my own experience of coming through it was a lot of kicking and screaming, and it was a lot of everything from psychological frustration to all the other elements. And so I have not applied academics to it. I haven't applied the more scholastic elements on how to work with it. I can name that in working with clients who have experienced similar experiences, I have had experiences where they're having spiritual awakenings and are completely agnostic and atheists, and being able to hold the space of the non-duality. And what I mean by the non-duality of naming the experience as real and the pain of the wound of what they experienced from their childhood religious wounding, and to be able to hold the space for both without fear. And like I keep physically doing this because they are both, right? They're both in the space at the same time. It's not an either or. And so it's like this dance to be able to do it. And so I do have the fortunate experience that was my personal experience as well. And as well as the shaming, as well as the everything else, then it shut down. And the challenge of, and I can name as well, which I did not include in my dissertation, but the challenge it came to opening back up the spirituality when I shut it off intentionally, because it was so painful and it was so hard. It's now that I'm talking about it, I'm like, there's another research project. but yeah.
You and I have many conversations that we can have around that as well, both personally and also experientially with clients as well. And my last question comes from my compliments to you for in this time of cultural trauma and planetary trauma, that something that, I mean, my heart just, I'm very emotional for you. I'm surprised right now. Wow. I'm very emotional for you that we're not all in space together and place together, and that I did not get to come to your place. And I might have done it via this because of time and that sort of thing. But the hope was to be there with you in space and place in your home, which is your school, and that place and campus, which holds your heart, and this expansion and this deepening that you've got to experience. And I understand the relationship that we have with the school when we get to do this deepening personal experience as well. And the what I know about CIIS and what I know about my campus, it was very important to go and have my defense there on campus and travel to it and have that. And so in honoring you for doing this on a Zoom with distancing and during this time, then how do you look at this work that you've been doing and the potential of having other times of working with clients when we're working at a distance? How do you hold this difficulty with self-regulation with the body, the embodied experience, the possibility of issues that might come up in that somatic experience and spiritual experience, and the limits that we have via telehealth, and how do we hold that for ourselves? Because I know for myself as a therapist doing this in this kind of space, my heart, that connection of being there is difficult, but also as a client with my therapist, I really miss having my therapist close by and having that help with that regulation process. And what do you observe in that right now during this time of distancing?
It's a really good question. The practice of it, like nothing can replicate this in person and the physicality, like flesh to flesh, body to body. And because I have cultivated such a practice with spiritual embodiment, and I have worked remotely with people, I do the work remotely. And what I say by that is I am there with them, and I know there's no physicality, but when we're working, and I call it my superpower. It's a trauma response. My trauma response when I was a kid was to be hypervigilant, to track everything, every dimension all the time. And so when I went the healing path, like I still can track everything, but for different reasons now. And so when I'm working with clients remotely and I can feel it, the hyperarousal starting to happen, I name it, or I ask what's happening, and then I start to move my energetic body. And so I'm in relationship with them, and I let them know that, and they can feel me there. And while it's not the replacement for physicality, it's a way of connecting our nervous system in a different way. And so I've worked with clients being able to regulate those things. And we've done the work where we bring certain things into the room, we go up and we go back down. And unfortunately, in the meantime, all we can use as supplementary are like transitory, like the teddy bear I've got on the countertop. We can use the physicality to supplement it in the meantime, until we can actually train that way.
I believe that's something that can be expressed by you in the field, whether with blogs or an addendum to this, is that you had this experience of ending, completing, coming to this space through COVID. And that is also such an important piece to give to the field of what that was like, both personally in your writing for other dissertation, for other doctoral students in their dissertation process of what COVID and how this feeling on the planet impacted your own complex trauma work, and the completion of your dissertation during this time, I believe has a lot of information to give future students as well as to colleagues, and also this process that we can do by being embodied as the therapist. We can feel through this experience, even if it's at a distance. And that's a new concept to telehealth, which is why telehealth keeps being limited, because they don't understand that we can actually have that feeling, and you have something to offer to that.
Thank you, because I forgot that's not common. But thank you. I really
thank you
for reflection.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about in the future. This is good.
Thank
you.
you, Danielle.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
questions. Absolutely. I'm going to turn it to Therese right now for questions, appreciations, feedback.
Sure. Just wanting to start with appreciations, Monica. Just the enormity of the work, both personally and as a researcher, and in sharing your process so boldly, and tenderly at the same time. I'm really struck by how with trauma that parts of ourselves can get kind of split off, and I really have this sense of how you've woven together all the parts of yourself and also reflected on what was happening and wrote about it and wrote about things that are difficult to articulate, and just really feeling that how you've brought together your story and your research and all this process. And I love that you the way that you addressed it in different ways, by moving, by drawing, by writing, by reflecting, just it all brings together that sense of like weaving towards something that feels whole and held. So I just want to honor and witness that process and just appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then just questions. It's almost the image you shared from your craniosacral teacher about being the biggest pendulum in the room. Is that what and what helped you grow your capacity to be the biggest pendulum in the room? And how do you keep refinding it if you get kind of skewed off, or what I feel like you've answered this in your dissertation, but just in this moment, as you start to name this, I think capacity.
Thank you. There's something in it. I'm like, I love that question. Thank you for asking that. The first thing that comes to mind is the willingness and the acceptance to be with what is. Because to me, like when I think about how much I have the capacity to hold, it's because all of that I've experienced. And it's not just because I experienced it, it's because I sat with it.
Yeah.
And the more I really, let's get in the dirty mud together and let's kick and scream together. And the more I do that, this capacity keeps growing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's building this trust. You're talking about the parts of ourselves have woven together. It's because it's this healing of the parts of myself, of not shaming, of not like, well, let's change you, let's reframe you. No, it's like, okay, let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
And not just a dialogue, but just a sitting with.
Yeah.
And just being with it. And what does it feel like? And being able to do that has really nurtured my bigger capacity. That's what really comes to mind.
Lovely. Thank you. And almost tagging on Danielle's question, as I hear you describe that and I see you moving, I really feel my whole system, my heart expanding, and just like I feel it in my whole system. So it appreciating your hard-won capacity, your hard-gained capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that, even saying that, acknowledging like all the wounds that I've gathered along the way, and I've sat with each and every single one. And to me, that's where the juice is. That's where the sweetness is.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's all the questions I have. So thank you so much for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Truly.
Thank you so much, Therese, for that. Monica, I've sat with you for a while now, and your journey has fluctuated and changed and shifted. And I remember when we first met, how excited you were about encountering this place where the psychological, somatic, and the spiritual came together, and what that did for you. And you really wanted to meet other people that have had that experience to validate your own experience, right?
Yep.
And you were just going, I'm going to find a group of women, or I'm going to find a group of people, and we're going to do somatic, and I'm going to validate me. And then the journey took you back to you, you know? The journey took you back to the autoethnography, that is where you needed to go for validation, and not so much this other external place again to say, look, it worked for me, did it work for others, you know? So this would be like, you know, how you had your different dates and stuff. This would be the next date, that this is even more deepening. This process of the dissertation itself even brought you closer to you, closer to that inner space, with the epoch and the bracketing and the way you approach the data through multidimensional ways and so on. So I'm just standing back looking at that journey that brought you back to you again. So, and it's from that place of bringing it back to you. And kind of, to me, the spiritual piece is how you've made of yourself an offering to the world, you know, is a very spiritual kind of motion or movement, if you will. You know, you've made of your experience, you've made of your journey an offering to be a healer and to bring healing. And so I have so much respect for your willingness, your bravery, your courage, and your brilliance, actually. I mean, this is very rigorous. It was not just little stories, you know? So, so much appreciation for this amazing work. So it's been really an honor to be with you on this journey. I can say that. And the other thing I want to say is we keep talking, you know, autoethnography, it's my story. How will it live in the world out there? And, you know, this is a limitation. Is it not a limitation? And you do talk about the Western mindset, moving out of the Western context, you know, and I just want to invite us all to look at the world through, you know, different mindsets that look at story as point and narrative as spaces for transformation, and not really necessarily the kind of linear academic, you know, theoretical, but really look at the stories, at how they come to live in the world, you know? And so that's what you bring forth. You bring forth these stories that are themselves narratives of transformation. And perhaps one thing I would invite you to do as a healer, as a therapist, as a coach in your work, and this goes back to also Danielle's question of how do you bring this to a Western mindset, is to even go further back and with clients to talk about the Western mindset, the expectations, what they believe healing was. And from your own experience, because you say at one point, well, I wasn't getting there because I wasn't doing it right. They were telling me what to do, but I wasn't doing it right. So we've been so, what's the word, internalized this kind of way of learning, this pedagogy, the banking style, as Paulo Freire says, if you are the sage, you are the expert, and you're going to give me answers, and you're going to tell me how it feels in my body because you know. And so even starting the people that come to you for healing even earlier, of the expectations of healing, what are your understandings of healing, and how that might take place, you know, sort of in that frame. So that was just coming to me when you were having the conversation with Danielle. I don't really have any questions per se, because we've been working on this together for a while, and I've asked the questions. I really, I'm really excited to see all the different nuggets and wisdoms and future studies that are emerging and can emerge out of this work. For example, online health and healing, which just came up briefly, right? The whole question about religion, you know, and spirituality, and multiple other ways and things that are going to come out of your work. So I'm really excited to see that. So thank you for inviting me to be on this journey, and congratulations on an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you
Right.
so much.
Yeah. So I would ask Danielle and Therese, are there other questions? Anything else that needs to be said before we confer privately? Okay. So what we typically do if we were in SCIS is the 3 committee members would leave the room. And so we are going to leave the room now. Because we're recording and you're the host, I don't have the capacity to do a breakout session on my screen.
So I've never. Oops.
So do you have, we can stop recording for a minute. I can become the host, create the breakout session.
We can do that, because I don't know how to do a breakout.
Or the 3 of us can just leave the Zoom meeting for a minute and use the telephone. How about that for Danielle and Therese?
Mm-hmm.
It's another room. And then you can have a conversation, and the questions and answers and feedback can continue with the people present. So should we do that? All right, so I'm going to leave the meeting and I'm going to go to another room, and I'm going to call both Therese and Danielle on the phone.
Okay. I'll just stop my video and mute myself.
Yeah, that's what I'm
while
going to
go away. Yeah.
I'm going to do that too, rather than leave it.
Leave the room. Okay.
Okay then. Hi.
I just wanted to say I was just riveted, and I got the feeling like I was on this huge skyscraper with you, and we're looking over the edge, and I'm going, I'm not going to jump, I'm not going to jump. And then you jumped, and you didn't fall. You lilted down to the bottom, and you landed.
God. Thank you for that. I love
You're so
that.
welcome. You're so welcome. Yes. Yeah, I have way too many questions to answer, but the main thing that I was curious about is how did you hold on to the activation and then do this deep work as well? I mean, you know, you're feeling stuff and you're feeling stuff. How do you stop, or how do you do it in process like that?
Yeah,
or are there 2 separate things?
No, it's the same thing, and it's like I said, it's not easy. It's challenging. It's
right.
It's a lot of cultivation of like I said, like I practice this experience of like non-duality, and it's getting to this place like when I work with clients of when they feel anxiety, of like, okay, there's room for anxiety, and the calm person, like, oh, so the anxiety can be here and I can be calm at the same time.
Right.
So it starts there. And then when I'm in a state of activation, it's the same thing for me, is that there's an activation that happens, like, oh, that's what's happening. And there's room for the observer to witness what's going on. And sometimes when I name it, my partner, who's in the room holding space for me, because he's amazing, is
hi.
that he...
Brianna, this is Winnie Crittenden. And you left a message with me at Maybe we should have it.
But it's holding when I can name what's happening at the same time. To externalize it helps me to have space for both, because I can have that experience. And it's a lot of the practice starts with being reactive, having that reactivity without it becoming me. Like I can have the experience, but the experience isn't me.
Yes, I can feel that. You know, I have similar things going on because I have history too, right? We all have history, and just by listening to you describe how you do it, I can look back in my very recent past and see, oh yeah, that's what I was doing. That's how I got through that. And you know, I can totally catch what you're doing. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. One last piece about it as well is that because being anchored in the body helps me to do that as well. Because if I can anchor a part of me like that's grounded, like the place I like I named is like if I'm rooted, I put my conscious orientation down into my sacrum, behind my belly button sometimes. but it's almost like the anchor's there.
Right.
And so I'm connected to that part of my body that feels the safest, and the hypervigilance, the other thing can still happen while it's occurring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Can answer any other questions if you want to, or anybody else has anything to ask, I am happy to answer. Hey Mary, real quickly, can you type the question, because you keep going in and out and I can't hear what you're saying.
I think I realized that I'm on I switched over to the next door internet, so I think this time I'm back on. But I just wondered if you could just share a little bit what arises as to the potency and the power of transformation that your journey offers in terms of where we are in this reset as a species toward a kind of regeneration, a kind of trauma recovery of the forces of racism and capitalism and patriarchy. I mean, all the things that have been trauma to ourselves and to the planet.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
a really broad question. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's an important one. It's a bigger one on a more, like, even in a very specific practical one that I've been acutely aware of and concerned about, is because of, as soon as the shelter in place went into effect, and the heightened fear. And I know that the kids who are stuck at home and have nowhere to go, and the parents are stressed out, that the physical and emotional abuse is exacerbated. And so I've been very much aware of that, like in a more specific thing. I've been in conversations with certain organizations of how do we prepare when people start coming out of it, because a lot of my work looks at because we're in it, right? And so unless you're like an advanced practitioner, you can't be in it, be triggered and process at the same time. And so I've been in dialogue with people of how do we start setting up the systems that are needed, especially for the youth and the care and those who don't have the resources. So we already have it in place for them to go when we come out. The larger conversations is a big question, and I don't have answers to, but it's definitely been it's noodling. I don't know if this is bad to say, but there is a part of me who's like, think like there's an opportunity here to reset. And so the more I've been able to have conversations with people around like, what do we want to move towards? How do we not just change the systems, but like, how do we really create systems that are healthy? And even in the educational model, like how do we change the way we're educating the kids so it's not this dogmatic authoritarian, just regurgitate and I'm the authority and you aren't. How do we really change the way we engage and we talk to one another? And so at least having those conversations with the right people who are aware that like the previous systems were not working. And so let's have the conversations now before we reopen up and what we can do to reset it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers any piece of the question.
That's beautiful. Thank you again. What an honor to bear witness and to learn and to be emancipated in part, more. So thank you for doing this work on behalf of the planet and all of us.
Thank you.
Very clear. Yeah. Very clear, yeah. Well, Monica, so your committee went away and confirmed for a long time and came back. And it's my honor and my privilege to congratulate you on passing this phenomenal presentation and defense. Congratulations.
Thank
and
you.
from the bottom of my heart, I am thrilled to say that to you. This was a beautiful presentation. It was clear, it was concise, it was coherent. You were able to bring all those ideas and multi-dimensions that are in your dissertation and concisely present them in a very meaningful way. It was so good and so meaningful that we are going to ask you to include in your dissertation as an addendum or an appendix, whatever you want to call it, the three areas, the cognitive, the somatic, and the spiritual, what the theories are, what the benefits are, and what the challenges are, as a table at the end, because that was so good. It just summed it up. That was brilliant. So yes, and so the other thing that came out from this defense, and that you just so brilliantly articulated and demonstrated, is how we do this work at this time of shelter in place, at this time of COVID and pandemic. And so also maybe a one-page addendum to the dissertation, sort of reflecting on that, could be such a benefit to readers, therapists, could, you know, really start people thinking along those lines, because you have a lot of wisdom right now to offer as you've just engaged in that process and completing a dissertation at this time and presenting it. So again, congratulations on an excellent job, Monica. I knew you'd get here, and you. So I'm going to open it up to the committee to also offer their. Danielle, Therese.
Well, I just think that covered the things that we were impressed with, and for me personally, it was such a strong ability to take, especially to be able to see the enormity of the research that you brought together, and to be able to speak to it in a scholarly way in those 30 to 40 minutes in that presentation, really said what's very important, because when you go on to go to conferences and speak to this, you may have 15 to 30 minutes to speak on your process, and you've already got this established right here. So you already have a conference presentation that's ready that could lead to other pieces of information, as well as these tables, and that information is so important. And the piece that I would add to the COVID is also what it was like for you to go through the ritual of this embodied experience of your defense in COVID, and have that online as well. I think that that's really important in this embodied experience of our defense, because we know what it's like to come from a little bit of a non-traditional school, and again, that place that's so important into our bodies, and for you to be able to hold that and be able to hold that for future people, because we might go through this again, or like Pacifica was closed a couple of years ago because of the fires and the floods. There's other things that happens to our place that transitions us in the way that we do this work, and you have so much to offer for that.
Thank you.
I don't really have anything to add, just other than honoring all your work, and congratulations, Dr. Martin.
Yay!
Thank you.
Dr. Monica Martin.
Thank you. I officially, I love Doc Martin, so I bought myself a special pair of Doc Martens. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So next